Welcome back to my ongoing element series. This is where I talk about a set of elements from common to rare and highlight the coasters that I believe do it best. In the past, I already talked about some big hitting crowd pleasers like the Zero G roll and the Immelman inversion. And if you want to check out those videos, you can watch them on the info tab on the screen or in this video's description right below the subscribe button. Just like part 2, I'll be talking about 8 more coaster elements ranging from common to rare. My name is Avery and this is United Coasters. We'll start this video off with a splash, with splash tracks and effects. Although these are 2 separate elements, they more or less do the same actions. Splash tracks are mainly used on coasters made by Intamin and Mock rides. With its main use on water rides, you take this element with high speed, usually as the first element on a water coaster. However, this coaster element kind of seems negligent on most rides. That's because instead of getting you soaked, like at the end of any other water ride, these elements don't produce that much water to splash virtually anyone on ride. You can see this on Intamin water coasters like Speed at Energylandia. Since there's track after this element, it's a no-brainer that you wouldn't take on too much water, as the coaster would just slow down tremendously. So it's more for show than anything. But Mock ride's power splash models solve this problem by making it the main part of the ride. This is apparent in all of their power splash coasters, like Aquaman Power Wave at Six Flags Over Texas. After the final backwards launch into the vertical spike, you can see the water pooling in the track's basin. And since you don't enter the element with too much speed, you get the full effect as if it were a splashdown, right before rising up into the station. Just like how splash tracks don't stop the coaster train altogether, splash effects are similar to an extent. Only seen on B&M coasters, these elements work by having scoops attached to the end of coaster trains. When the coaster gets close to a section of water, these tubes scoop it up and project the water out and upward. In relation to splash tracks, splash effects are more effective in braking than the former, and some even have an added benefit that allows parkgoers to get splashed if they're too close to the area. One of the best hypercoasters that has splash effects is at Diamondback at Kings Island in Ohio. Near the end of this coaster, you get a nice view of this element in action, and it's such a big thing that even people in the back row can possibly get wet. The best one I've witnessed that has a splash area is the B&M dive coaster SheiKra at Busch Gardens, Tampa. After diving underneath the splash effect track piece, you pop out, turning up and around to skim through it. You can definitely feel the slowdown during the splash, and if you're in that splash zone, you're gonna get soaked watching this part. Moving on to an element that everyone can experience, we have the horseshoe element. This consists of 3 main parts and acts as a high banked 180-degree turnaround that tilts its riders at least 90 degrees. It's a great high thrilling or panoramic view to turn around on the track. The 90-degree tilt can either point you inwards or out, and is mainly a feature on flying or inverted coasters. Coming at a close second to do it best is Superman Ultimate Flight at Six Flags Over Georgia, with its panoramic view over the area. But if we're talking about a high, off-the-ground, quick transition, then Tatsu at Six Flags Magic Mountain has it beat. And if anything, it's a nice way to set up that breathtaking pretzel loop ahead. Getting into rarer elements as we go further on this list, we have top hats. This is mostly associated with launch coasters, as it starts with a dramatic ascent angling you 90 degrees up, only to crest over and straight down 90 degrees again. This element was the staple of the 2 previous tallest coasters in the world, Tokdo Dragster and King Ka, where riders were launched up into this element at the max heights of 420 feet and 456 feet respectively. Even though this usually is the main part of the coaster, not all coasters that have a top hat use it as so. Pantheon at Busch Gardens Williamsburg and Velocicoaster at Universal's Islands of Adventure both have their top hats act as a midpoint to the rides. The best coaster with the top hat that I've ridden has to be Accelerator at Knott's Berry Farm. Albeit a fast moment, the changes in momentum on this element is unreal. We're going to take that last element and invert it for the next one, with the inside top hat. Just like the one we just discussed, this element has you reaching a high point on a coaster only to twist you inside by 90 degrees and complete an inversion at the apex of the element. The inside top hat is definitely rare, with less than 20 coasters having it. The only inside top hat that I've experienced was riding on the reverse side of Mr. Freeze at Six Flags Over Texas. And I gotta say that after being launched out backwards at 70 miles per hour in less than 4 seconds, this inside top hat was just icing on the cake for an insane start and end for the shuttle coaster. And even though top hats are more of a launch coaster's bread and butter, conventional chain lift coasters have them too. Take for instance the Vekoma Wildcat model, Phoenix at Far Up Summerland in Denmark, where the inside top hat is the first of 3 inversions. This type of element is getting some love in its usage recently because along with Phoenix, both Mahuka at France's Wallaby Roan's Alps Park and Alpenferry at Canada's Wonderland will have them in their layout. But in my opinion, the best coaster currently sporting this element has to be Voltron at Europa Park in Germany. Looking past its awe-inspiring theme and the vertical bounce track, the LSM lift tilt into the inside top hat just looks absolutely amazing. And you want to know what else is absolutely amazing? If you subscribe to this channel. Next, we'll look at the exact opposite of the notorious Immelman inversion, the dive loop. Instead of rising high into the sky, twisting out backwards at a 180-degree angle, this element starts with you in the air, twisting you and sending you down in a quick and fluid motion. And even though this element is on a litany of coasters, I feel as if it doesn't get talked about as much. And that's only because it's not usually a prominent feature in the coaster's layout. I mean, take Canobie at Lagoon. This coaster does have a dive loop, but among the most prominent and gut-dropping moments of this coaster is the fall into the Immelman inversion, or Kumba at Busch Gardens Tampa. This coaster does have a dive loop, but it's more to position itself into that floaty 0G roll, and it's mostly forgotten due to that iconic first loop that goes through the lift hill. So in my eyes, there's really only one manufacturer of coasters that I personally believe has done the dive loop justice consistently. And that's RMC, both with its Raptor models and my all-time favorite dive loop element on Air Force One at Fun Spot Atlanta. Both coasters use this type as one of its first inversions after the first drop, but the way they profiled the inversion on Air Force One has you thrown to the right before being launched down to your left with some serious force. The ferocity of this first inversion on the ride justifies my claim that a dive loop should not be overlooked as an overall great element. Now we're getting into more rarely seen inversions with the Norwegian loop. This element is more akin to a pretzel loop, but since it's done with a sit-down coaster train rather than an invert, it needs additional twists to have you above the track on the bottom of the loop. If you were to break it down more, this dual inverting element is as if a dive loop and Immelman were put together. Currently, there's only 3 coasters that support this element. 2 are Intamin made, with the launch coaster Speed Monster at Sundenfrid in Norway and the vertical chain lift hill coaster Fahrenheit at Hershey Park. The newest coaster with this element is the Mock Rides launch coaster Helix at Liseberg in Sweden. And even though the rendition of the Norwegian loop looks more natural in this layout, or how Fahrenheit makes it the standout moment on its ride, nowhere does it look more insane than watching it be the first element after the 53-mile-per-hour hydraulic launch on Speed Monster. I can't even fathom the jaw-dropping forces you would get while riding this. I mean, that snap into the first part of its drop just looks awesome. Second to last, we'll talk about our first element variation. In a nutshell, these are elements that are significantly tweaked to make it unique to a specific ride. Think of the Drachenfire dive loop on Kennywood's Steel Curtain. Although it's similar to a conventional dive loop, its placement and design garners a variation and makes it solely unique for that ride. So for this video, we'll talk about the JoJo roll. Breaking it down, it's a standard Heartline roll inversion, but instead of having it in pace with the coaster's layout, the B&M Foilers coaster Hydra the Revenge at Dorney Park in Pennsylvania puts this at the very beginning of the coaster. Before even ascending the 95-foot lift hill, you're subjected to a blood-pooling, slow inversion right out of the station. Although this isn't the most fierce element on a coaster, it is bizarre to see it on a coaster with 6 other inversions, and just mesmerizing to watch off-ride. The Heartline variation name JoJo came from Joe Green, one of the heads of construction for the coaster, pondering the question of just, could it be done? And just like that, this preliminary inversion was born, on a B&M floorless of all coasters. Alright, I know that last one wasn't that cool, so let's end this list with a heart-pounding, one-of-a-kind inversion. The Flying Snake Dive. This can only be found at Hershey Park in Pennsylvania on the Intamin launch coaster Stormrunner. After being launched into a blistering 72 miles per hour in under 3 seconds flat and undergoing a top hat, you complete another one-of-a-kind inversion called a Cobra Loop, and that exits you into a Heartline roll and finally into the Flying Snake Dive. Think of a Heartline roll mixed with a dive loop and you have the Flying Snake Dive. I don't know about you, but there's just something so crazy about seeing all that momentum rising out of inversion after inversion just to be flipped yet again and sent down with so much force. The off-ride POVs do it justice by showing just how surreal this element is in action. And the fact that the Flying Snake Dive hasn't been seen on any other coaster just adds to the ingenuity of Intamin on Stormrunner. That's all I have this time for coaster elements, but if you've been on any of these rides or experienced any of these elements, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have any more elements you want me to highlight, let me know about that too. Also, I know the majority of y'all watching are not subscribed. So if you aren't and liked what I had to say, you should subscribe and join in on the fun. Lastly, I just want to say thank you for watching, and remember to stay united.